Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of Lebanon. First, just a quick disclaimer. It's very, very hot here today, so I need my window open. Otherwise, it's going to be like a sauna in here. So I apologize if you hear any sounds of the city outside if that's not your thing. But I need to stay conscious so I can film this for you guys. I'm already sticking to the book, which kind of makes a nice sound anyway. So, Lebanon. Lebanon is located in the Middle East of Western Asia in an area known as the Levant. It has this border with Syria up here. It's a very long border. And it has a border here with Israel. And this over here is the Mediterranean Sea. Very, very important to its history. But let's do geography first. And then we'll flip through this book. I have this at a weird angle so you could see it well, so I'll adjust it so that we can look at the book and see the pictures. Even though this book is from like 2005, it's so old and so much has happened in Lebanon. At least the beautiful geography is there in the pictures. So Lebanon has 4 distinct areas, and it's really funny because I'm from California, and the geography reminds me very much of just like a tiny squished down California. It's got nearly all the regions that California has. It's got the surf and beaches, it's got the mountains, the forests with the remarkable trees, the farmland valley. It's got pretty much all of it, just no desert, which is kind of unusual for a Middle Eastern country, isn't it? No desert at all in Lebanon. Also no oil, but we'll talk about that later. Over here is, of course, the beautiful coast. It's pretty much where the majority of people live. It's where all the major cities are, and where the capital city of Beirut lies, right here. Other major cities, well, actually, I'm going to mention them in the history because they were established super long ago, including Beirut. So we'll come back to that. The second region is the Mount Lebanon region, which is the big mountains that cut through here. Lebanon is apparently derived from a Phoenician word that means white, referring to the snow up on the mountains. And the highest point is right up here. It's called Kunat al-Sauda, which basically just means Mount Lebanon in Arabic, I believe. And you can see up here there's a site that says the Cedars of Lebanon. And it's in these mountains where the most iconic feature of Lebanon's geography is located, and that is its cedar trees. It's their national pride and joy. It's on their flag, and we'll talk about it in its history. I had to put some leaves on my nails, even though they're palm leaves, but we're going to do 2 countries this week, one of them being Lebanon. The other is also a very tree-centric country, so I had to have leaves on this week. But anyway, the next section would be the Pica Valley. You can see it labeled right there, running right through here. This area is very, very lush and fertile farmland. It's the most fertile part of pretty much the whole Middle East. And the longest river flows from it down here to the Mediterranean. It is the Litani River. And then the last part would be the Anti-Lebanon Range, Anti-Lebanon Mountains that kind of just come through here, meaning against the Lebanon Mountains, right? And it kind of flows into the Mount Hermon mountain range down here. And that's essentially the geography of Lebanon. Very, very beautiful country. It's one of those places that I've always considered to be like too beautiful. Like, how can this place even be real? Because it's just so lovely. The scenery and everything. It's very unreal, and I think that's one of the reasons why and people settled here as early as they did because it was just a very beautiful, lush place full of resources and anything an ancient culture could possibly want or need. So let's get into that. The earliest civilization that we know of in this area would have been the Canaanites. And eventually the Egyptians would take over the area for a little bit. But out of that came a civilization known as the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the ones who built up the cities along the coast, so let's go through those. Tyre was a very big, important one. It was basically like the major Phoenician city. Next would have been Sidon, which was pretty much like number 2. Beirut, which was not really what it was called. I forget what it was, but it sounded a lot like Beirut. And near that would have been Byblos, which is the oldest out of all of them. Apparently, Byblos comes from like the word that eventually means book, right? That's where the word Bible comes from, but it comes from the, what was it? The Egyptian word for paper, because they would ship papyrus here to ship out to other places. Apparently. I could be way wrong on that, but that's what I remember from my research. And then up here we have Tripoli, which was 3 different cities close together that they just kind of merged into one. Hence the 3 cities, Tripoli. The Phoenicians were famous for quite a lot of things. First would have been their trade. They were very famous for the fact that they sailed across all the Mediterranean, established all the trading sites. They were very skilled sailors, and they, traveled all over the place. They pretty much traded all the way up to Spain and Morocco, like that end of the Mediterranean. So the whole sea here was pretty much their domain. They established other colonies along the African coast and the Spanish coast. The most famous one would have been Carthage, which would eventually become more powerful than the Phoenician lands over here. They were also very famous for inventing the world's first alphabet, which is where we get the words phonetic from. Their alphabet is the earliest ancestor of the Latin alphabet that's used in English, French, Spanish, German, etc., Italian, all of the above. And lastly, they would have been famous for the cedar trees that grew up here, but that's pretty much true for all the civilizations that lived in this area. But these trees were found all over the place, the wood, I should say. A lot of Egyptian sites, the tombs that have been found had Lebanese cedar in them. I'm gonna have to adjust myself because I sweated all over Jordan down here and now it's wrinkly. Oh dear, I'm gonna water damage my big fancy atlas. Okay, I'm just gonna lean over here. What was I saying? The cedar trees found in Egyptian tombs, and it's believed that the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was built with Lebanese cedar wood. Very famous trees. Eventually, the Assyrians would have conquered the area, and then the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, I should say. We'll talk about the Syrians later in its history. The Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, took over the area, and then eventually the Achaemenid Persians conquered the Babylonians, which apparently people here are very grateful for, as in other places. Then the Achaemenids were conquered by Alexander the Great. This came under Greek rule. Once he died, all of his lands fell into the ownership of his generals, which would eventually seg into Roman territory, right? Meanwhile, the Phoenicians are just doing their thing, trading and just sailing around the Mediterranean. Eventually, the Roman Empire would split. This area would come under the control of the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire. And Christianity arrived here very quickly after its invention. And the people here took to it very quickly, as they did in a lot of Byzantine areas. there was a sect of Christianity that came about in what's now Lebanon, known as the Maronites. And they were like a kind of monastic sect of Christianity. And they stayed up in the mountains just to kind of stay away from all the drama, basically, that comes from religion. And same thing happened in the 7th century when the Muslim Arabs invaded, took over, brought Arabic and Islam, their religion. A sect of Islam kind of sprung up here in the mountains known as the Druze. And they stayed up in the mountains just to kind of keep away. The mountains are, these mountains at least, are so incredibly important to the history of Lebanon. The area was pretty much just known as Mount Lebanon. And in ancient times, Mount Lebanon and Lebanon were interchangeable. Like, it was the same thing. So, considering that the people lived up here in Mount Lebanon, they were the Lebanese peoples, right? In the 11th century, the Crusades came to the area when a lot of Europeans, Christian Europeans, I should say Catholic Europeans, came and tried to reconquer land from the Muslims. They came into this area, they established the county of Tripoli and built quite a few Crusader castles and strongholds in the area. But they would eventually lose and leave, and the area was soon controlled by the Mamluks, which was an Islamic dynasty from Egypt. And eventually that would come under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire from Turkey, in what was Byzantium. It was now then Constantinople and now Istanbul. So, meanwhile, the people here are still just doing their thing. They are sailing, they are trading, they are living their lives. Beirut in particular becomes a very prosperous port city, as it has been forever, but it was kind of really thriving during this time with all of the trade going on. And for the most part, the variety of religions in the area, with the Maronite Christians, the Druze, not to mention Sunni and Shiite Muslims, sort of just kind of coexisted for a long time until they didn't, until other foreign interests got their fingers into the people here and managed to spark conflict. The first one being in 1860 with the Mount Lebanon Civil War. The French were supporting the Maronites, the British were supporting the Druze. Of course, the French and the British have to be against each other in any situation at this time in history. And it got very bloody. It really turned into a very, very vicious fight. So, other outside forces, like other Arab forces, got involved. Not the Ottomans for some reason. To stop this. And it was basically come to the conclusion that these religions needed to be separate but equal, in a way that it should be divided up so that different religions controlled different sections. But the people were living side by side for so long, and we're all mixed together in different towns. There was no like area that was just Christian, just Sunni, just Druze, just Shia, you know. So it was quite a conflict that still kind of remains to this day. After World War I, the area became a French mandate, because after the Ottoman Empire broke apart, the British and the French divided up their territory over what they would control. The people here weren't too pleased about that. Oh, I'm melting over Jordan again. Anyway, and Egypt. Okay. So, in World War II, once this area came under the control of Vichy France, right? And the Nazis were coming in to try to set up an invasion of this area. The Allies invaded and took it back. And there was a plan to make it like a part of like Free France, basically, but the people here were like, no, we're going to be independent. We don't really care. And, essentially, independence was declared on November 22nd, 1943. And there, from what I could tell, there was no like official like France didn't pull out of the mandate Like, they didn't really agree to it until they had to when the UN was formed and Lebanon was a founding member. So obviously it was none of their control anymore. Now in 1943, there was an unwritten law called the National Pact, which was meant to be a solution to the whole religion issue in Lebanon. A census was taken just to see how many of each people of each religion lived in the country, and it was determined at the time that the majority were Maronite Christians, and therefore they decided that the president would always be Maronite, the Speaker of Parliament would always be Shia, the Prime Minister would always be Sunni, and the Deputy Speaker and Deputy Prime Minister would always be Greek Orthodox. And Lebanon has never had a census since then, because they didn't want to change that, apparently. But some issues came up with this. I mean, a lot of issues came up with this. In that, I'll skip ahead a little bit. There are now many, many more Muslims in the country than Maronite Christians, so, you know, but the people in power don't want to give up their power. I won't skip ahead. Let's stay in the timeline. I'm sorry, Egypt. I'm now wrinkling Cairo. Okay. And Saudi Arabia. Okay. Oh my goodness. So, in 1948, down here, of course, in Israel was a whole mess, and many Palestinians fled north into Lebanon as refugees. The Arab-Israeli War had broken out, and Lebanon didn't really officially join. They did a little bit of invading, but their main contribution was to help Syria and Egypt and Jordan with like supplies and soldiers and things like that, and to take in refugees. And there's still many, many Palestinian refugees. Once the war ended, Israel did not allow the refugees to return, and they never have, so they're still there. And it's been quite an issue after the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had to leave Jordan due to all the conflicts. They came into Lebanon, started operating their attacks on Israel from Lebanon. So Israel started attacking Lebanon, in particular the refugee camps there, where a lot of these people were operating from, allegedly. And that would just create even more conflict, you know. Eventually, a group sprung up in Lebanon known as Hezbollah that was anti-Israeli and would do everything to fight against Israel, and still is to this day. Eventually, a civil war would break out in 1975 between the various different religious militias that sprang up in Lebanon. Hezbollah would be one of them, but there was a militia for the Maronites, so on and so forth. They all fought each other. The Arab League deployed the Syrian military into Lebanon to try to ease things over. It really just only made things so much worse. Israel even invaded and sacked Beirut in 1982. It was a really horrible mess. Whenever there's a horrible mess in Lebanon, it's very bloody and very rough, and it was a very bad time, basically. And it never really got truly resolved. It ended in a ceasefire agreement. It officially ended in 1990, but the Israelis didn't leave until the year 2000. And, you know, Lebanon tried to get back on its feet, and kind of was for a while. You know, they did in the 1960s or so, then the Civil War happened, and then when it ends, they did again until 2005. The Prime Minister, Rafiq Hariri, who was a very beloved figure, was assassinated, and a revolution, the Cedar Revolution, sprang up, which was a peaceful protest against Syrian occupation and to figure out exactly what happened with that assassination. And I won't get into that. I'm actually skipping over, or I'm going to skip over a lot of political things just because it's too messy, and I'm no expert in it. So The Cedar Revolution got the Syrian military to finally pull out of the country. In 2006, a war sprung up between Lebanon and Israel. It was pretty brief, but Hezbollah was like, let's fire rockets into Israel. And Israel attacked. So that thankfully ended with talks and before it could escalate into something worse. Then in 2012, Syria erupted into civil war and many, many refugees came into Lebanon, most of which are still there to this day. And by 2019, things were getting pretty bad in terms of government, with each head of government being a different religious group. Everyone was pretty much just looking after their own interests. And it was pretty much like the rich were getting all their needs met while everyone else wasn't. And the economy started to collapse. Their money was collapsing, basically. The gas prices were skyrocketing. Gas was almost impossible to find. The government decided to issue taxes on some ridiculous things like WhatsApp messages. Can you imagine how horrible that would be? And the power companies were saying, we don't have the money or the energy to run electricity, so there were huge power outages. So it was very clearly like slowly marching toward becoming a failed state because of all of this political gridlock. Huge protests sprung out. Many people resigned, and that was a whole... I'm not going to get into that. It was a big mess. But it all culminated on August 4th, 2020, when a shipping container in Beirut exploded. It was full of... oh goodness, I just forgot. The nitrous oxide, I want to say. And apparently it had been sitting there since 2012, and the various governments was just kind of pushing the need to do something about it back and forth between each other until there was a fire in that warehouse, and it boom, and it leveled a huge part of the city. Many people not only lost their lives but became instantly homeless. And when it came out that this explosion was due to the government and the lack of care that the government was doing in the area, all the cleanup was done by like civilians in the area. Protests got even worse, and it's still pretty much that's how it is today. There was an election in May of 2022. I'm filming this 2 months after that, so it's kind of too soon to say what will come of that. A lot of independent politicians were elected who promised reforms. Hezbollah lost some seats but are still pretty prominent in the government. And that's pretty much where Lebanon is today. It is a huge political mess, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's very hard to say what's going to happen in Lebanon, but we really do hope for the best, because like I said, this country is so beautiful and deserves to be flourishing, right? So anyway, that was it in a nutshell. There's so much more to it, but I really don't want to get into it because it's all very nitty-gritty political, and that's not what I'm really into. I like geography and history. This isn't a political channel. I don't find stuff like that relaxing anyway, so why don't I fix this angle and we'll flip through the book. Okay, let's flip through and see what we've got in here. This book, like I said, is very, very old. It's from like 2005, I want to say. So I couldn't really rely on this for history and stuff. Let's see, but you can see the gorgeous landscape here. It is so lovely. There's some fishing boats here on the water. Here's the political map of Lebanon, all the cities around there. And results of the chaos that's happened for many, many years in Lebanon. And this is Beirut, and look at, you can see the big snow-capped mountains over there. Isn't that cool? They say it's one of those places, we see it in California too, where you can surf and ski in the same day. Although much more of a drive to the mountains in California than Lebanon. Gorgeous little stream, waterfall here. into the water. So beautiful. Like, look at this. The mountains in the background, the lush green. It's such a beautiful place. And let's see, it says this is not far from Beirut, but there's a, doesn't say Church of the Christ Roy, I'm not sure. Anyway, here's Byblos. Very, very old city. The mountains. And the river. So let me see. This one is Nar al-Kalb, or the Dog River. And this is the Litani River, the longest river in Lebanon. And this valley is apparently where Adonis from Greek myth lived and died. Here's a physical map. You can see all the big mountains there. There's the Adonis Valley that I just mentioned. The lush, fertile farmland there in the Pica Valley. Baalbek. I didn't mention Baalbek. Baalbek is kind of more in the interior in the Pica Valley, and it's full of these really cool Roman ruins. Really, really neat. Let's see, this city here. This must be, it doesn't say. Oh, here we go. This is Tripoli. This is a souk in Tripoli. This is Tyre, and that's very obvious because there's these very famous Roman ruins in Tyre. I believe they're Roman, but that's kind of like the big landmark in Tyre. Some cedar trees. They're so beautiful and lush, beautiful forest. Here's an old drawing of trees being felled and shipped off to Jerusalem. Beautiful wildflowers. You've got medlar, I think, a kind of fruit that grows there. And look at these, the ibex. Look at those horns. Incredible. Here's a jackal. Oh, there's some amber down here. There's a spider in it. It's kind of creepy, so I'm sorry if spiders upset you, but this talks about how the world's oldest spider web was found in Lebanon, preserved in amber. Isn't that wild? Okay, creepy spider's gone. Beautiful herons. And this is a hoopoe, I believe. Hoopoe. We don't have those birds where I live, but they're really cute. And sadly, a house destroyed during the Civil War. And it's talking about the pollution you get with big cities, right? Some little baby just hatched turtles running to the ocean. And a really great picture of the big, big cedar trees. History. Let's see. This is in Tyre. More ruins. And some Phoenicians trading. The name Phoenician is actually what the Greeks called them. It's just the name that stuck through history. I don't think we know what they were actually called. But they were named that because they sold this cloth made out of purple dye. And that comes from the word for purple. Some little glass jars here, it says. That's really cool. The Phoenician alphabet, where we get our alphabet today, believe it or not. Phoenicia and Babylonia. So, Phoenicians way out here, Babylonians here. You can see just how far they all went. And here's a Persian army fighting. Greek and Roman empires. You can see Alexander's empire and the Roman Empire. There's Alexander right there. We've got St. Peter and Paul, who traveled to Lebanon to preach Christianity back when it was like a brand new religion. And how Islam expanded after 632. Some Crusaders fighting the Muslims down here. Ottoman soldiers marching, or clopping on their horses too. A map of the Ottoman Empire. The orange would be 1481, and the brighter orange, I guess, would be 1520. So you can see Lebanon's right here. And yeah, they're part of the Ottoman Empire. Very old-looking engraving of trade in Beirut. The League of Nations here, set up after World War I, who gave Lebanon to the French to control a Palestinian refugee camp in 1955. It's called The City That Hearts Built. Apparently a lot of the camps just turned into regular neighborhoods. Kind of sad. Rioting in 1958. And, let's see, in Egypt, Israeli soldiers drive there. Oh, okay, so these are Israeli soldiers going into Egypt during the 6-Day War. I guess they just needed a picture there. And the PLO having a meeting there. And let's see, militias fighting in Beirut. And Israel invading. And an attack on an American headquarters in 1983. It's a very turbulent time. There's Hezbollah. And the beautiful flag, which I think it talks about on the next page. Here's the Parliament building. Isn't that gorgeous? Here we go. Let me grab a pencil. Lebanon's flag. The focal point of Lebanon's national flag is the Lebanese cedar tree, symbolic of the country's history, holiness, and desire for peace. The flag is lined with broad red stripes on the top and bottom, symbolizing sacrifice. This was the president when this book came out. And here's Rafik Hariri, who was prime minister for the longest, and he was still alive when this book came out. His death changed so much in the country. There's a map here of Beirut, which, here there's a picture over here of the Pigeon Rocks, a really famous spot that's right here. And let's see, big, tall buildings. Oh dear, Syrians near Tripoli, it says. So much conflict, but so much rebuilding after that happened. And banking is a huge industry. Kind of one of the reasons why the economy's collapsed so hard is that so much was put into banking. Is their currency, the Lebanese pound. And some tourists here looking at Baalbek. Resources map. So you can see cereal crops, cash crops, citrus, tobacco, and that's pretty much it. That's all they really have. There's some grapes. Everything else they need is imported, which is why the docks being blown up was such a huge deal, you know. Anyway, look at these beautiful faces here. Very, very sweet. Let's see, persons per square mile, so you can really see everyone pretty much lives very much here and then kind of spread out elsewhere. There's a bustling crowd. Some Palestinians looking like they're not living in the best conditions. Two men greeting each other. They look like very good friends. Prayer beads. And sweet, sweet old person. A bank sign in Arabic and French. This French is still spoken there, not as much as Arabic and not as much as it used to, but it's still spoken there. There's some prayer happening there. And religious distribution, so as you can see, it's pretty much all over the place. It's Easter, you can tell by the inks here. And Muhammad in Mecca, it says. Interesting. Let's see what else. Oh, here's the Druze. If you've never heard of the Druze religion, there's kind of a reason in that they're a very secretive religion. It's a closed religion, it's called. It means like you can't just walk in and say, hey, can I join your religion? You have to be born into it, and all of the rituals and things are kept within the religion. The Quran, very pretty one. And more praying. And there's always a picture of Mecca. If it's a Muslim country, there's a picture of Mecca in these books. Here's some Christians praying at this little altar. Here is Jesus turning water into wine. And a Maronite monastery up in the mountains. Here is a cardinal, I guess he's Catholic then, and some more Maronite caves and secret places. Oh wow, this is in Baalbek, the Temple of Jupiter. Old ruins. Khalil Gibran, he was a novelist and an artist. He wrote poems and things like that. Another author here, Amin Malouf. And look at this old man with a big old oud playing some good music, probably. Wonderful dancing here. Here's Fairuz, singer. The Museum of Lebanon, which you can see here, got pretty dinged up during the Civil War. But it was, for the most part, restored. A lot of it was looted, but here's the tomb of King Hiram, who was a very famous historical figure back in the day. That was thankfully saved. There's a wedding happening here. And horseback riding on the beach. How fun. Of course, football being a big sport. It's shopping for some veggies there. And some delicious looking food. Lots of olives, I see. Some tabbouleh and some baklava. And another picture of Beirut here. Big tall buildings. It's a newscaster there. She's about to go on the air, it says. And backgammon, one of the world's oldest board games, still played in Lebanon. And working hard in school. And getting a baby checkup at the doctor. Oh, and that's the end. Let me see. Yep, that's the end. Okay. I'm going to end this before I melt. I am dripping right now. And my book, oh, I sweated all over the book. Made some great sounds though, didn't it? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll have another video for about Lebanon for you tomorrow. It'll be a whisper video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night. 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 Look at this. Oh dear, oh dear. Sorry, Jordan. At least it was just the desert.